welcome to this masterclass on real estate with Trowers Hamlins. We're delighted to be running this session for you, and we hope that you'll enjoy this masterclass and get involved with the conversation. I'm going to pass over to our panelists from Trowers in just a moment, but first I'm going to quickly run through some of the house rules. First and foremost, please use the online question tool to post any questions that you have, and I will be posing them to our speakers after the presentation. Please also use this tool to let us know if you have any audio or visual problems during the masterclass, and we will do our best to solve them for you. Please note that this masterclass is being recorded, and the recording of the session will be sent to all registrants after the session, and it will also be available on our YouTube channel very shortly too. Please feel free to post about the webinar on social media using hashtag LCM webinar or LCM masterclass. And finally, we're running another masterclass at the end of this month with the University of Law, and this is going to be on everything that you need to know about qualifying work experience. So keep your eye on the LCN events page for more information and to register. Just before we start, I want to ask all attendees to answer the question, which should be appearing on your screens, about what stage you are at. And this will just help give our panelists an idea of how to shape some of their information in the masterclass for you today. Okay, so I'm going to give that a few more seconds. Okay, so it looks like we've got a lot of postgraduates and a lot of second and third year law students. Thank you very much. This will really help the panelists today understand what stage you're all at. And that is it from me. I'm going to now pass over to Jessica from Trowers. Jessica, over to you.
Thanks so much, Neve, and thanks everyone for attending. Yeah, I will start us off on this sort of journey into our real estate practice, and we'll just try to give you a bit of an overview of kind of what our day-to-day lives are like and what the practice comprises of. Can I get the next slide, please, Bethany? So specifically just to signpost, we'll start with some intros from all of us here. We've got Jazz and Tom here with me to help out with this session. Introduce a bit the sort of department, the practice, the clients, and some interesting transactions to give you a feel for that. Then we'll talk through a kind of typical day for each of us, which I often think is kind of a good way to get a really practical insight into what sort of life as a real estate lawyer at Trowers is like. And then we'll focus down onto a specific hypothetical site, just pulling out some of the key legal issues that we've come across in our different areas of real estate law from a really practical perspective. Next slide, please. Okay, so we'll start with some introductions. I'll start. I'm Jessica Arczynski. I am 8 years qualified at Trowers. I obviously sit in the real estate department, and I'm kind of in the residential section, and within that residential section, I'm within the affordable housing section of that department. So it's quite a big department. We have a lot of different areas, which is why we've brought on Tom and Jazz to try to speak to some of those wider sort of elements to real estate. Within that affordable housing, I'm a bit unusual in a sense as a real estate lawyer, since I don't really do much in the way of kind of buying, selling, developing property, which is what you normally associate a real estate lawyer with. I get involved quite a lot more with things like the funding of affordable housing, the structuring of affordable housing. So that's almost like being a kind of a corporate lawyer, dealing with subsidiaries and different kinds of structures to help develop affordable housing, and sort of policy vires. If you're a law student, you might know what vires means, but sort of powers and statutory powers, etc. More widely at Trowers, I'm very involved in kind of D&I, or equality, diversity, inclusion projects, and sit on lots of different networks. Very involved in kind of ESG and responsible business. And just to kind of get it out of the way, I'm Canadian, in case you're wondering about my accent. I did all of my law degree and I've all of my sort of from VAC scheme to training contract to qualification at Trowers. So my sort of lawyer life is very embedded in the UK. But before that, I was actually involved in sort of homelessness and housing projects in Vancouver in Canada. And that's part of what attracted me to Trowers, because there's such a kind of big real estate and in particular affordable housing practice here. Okay, I think that's enough from me. Tom, can I hand over to you?
Of course, yeah, thanks, Jess. I am Tom Hosking. I am an associate in the Trowers real estate department. I have been qualified for just coming up to 9 months now, so a lot more new to the game than Jess is, but yeah, so I'm very, very enthusiastic still. Not that Jess isn't, but yeah, I cover more commercial property, so particularly restaurant work. I do a lot of landlord and tenant work in that respect. I did a degree in history at university, and then I did the GD and LPC just over the road from our office at the University of Law in Moorgate. In terms of my wider contribution to Trowers, I'm involved in the football team. I run the football team, so yeah, I don't play very well, but I do run it. Yeah, and that's me. And then we have my colleague Jasmine.
Thanks, Tom. So yeah, I'm Jasmine Ratter. I am an associate at Trowers, and specifically in the planning and environmental team, although I do purely planning work. So I'll be talking mostly to planning in this webinar, touching upon what my excellent environmental colleagues do. I also am very much embedded at Trowers. I did my VAC scheme in 2013, which is a horrifyingly long time ago now, and began my training in 2015, qualified in 2017, having done 6 months in Dubai as part of my training contract as well. So the planning environmental team, we'll talk about this in a bit more detail in a moment, but it's previously just London-based, is now in Exeter and Manchester too, and we do a lot of non-contentious and contentious work, I'd say in equal measure, and growing all of the time, the team is. In terms of my educational background, I also did history at Sussex University and then converted to law, sadly at the now defunct Kaplan Law School, but it was an excellent place to study law. Next slide, please.
Okay, sweet. So we've heard a little bit from us, from our personal backgrounds, just a bit of an intro into the actual real estate practice at Trowers. It's a big practice, and it's fair to say that we really cover essentially all aspects of any transaction, work with a lot of different clients on within the real estate kind of wider market. One thing that I think is very particular about Trowers is our strength in both public and private sector, so we can really kind of bridge the two. We do have a particular strength around affordable housing. We've been sort of ranked #1 in that, and local authority sort of housing for, I mean, decades, I think, really. So we have that already, and we also have that wider commercial private sector practice. So that's important. And, you know, of course, all different parts of the sort of the wider firm are involved in any real estate transaction. So, you know, there's the development, etc., but also kind of banking and finance and construction and wider regulatory departments. Kind of grouped this session a little bit into residential, commercial, and planning environmental to speak to some degree to each of our strengths between myself, Tom, and Jazz. So you'll kind of keep seeing those themes come across. Can I get the next slide, please? Great, thank you. So just to get into the nitty-gritty of it a bit more, I mean, in terms of our clients and you know, on the residential side again, just to name a few, I mean, there's central government, local authority clients that I work with a lot. So, you know, say Homes England is a kind of central government department, local authority, everything from, you know, Greater London Authority to other authorities like Westminster Council. We do lots of work with them in real estate. We do work with lots of housing associations. Not sure how familiar you are with that term. I'll try to avoid jargon, but that's essentially, we call them RPs a lot, but that's a provider of affordable housing that has been registered with a specific government regulator. And so we work both with those housing associations, like some of the biggest, like Clarion, Hyde, Peabody Trust, but also with the regulator themselves who regulates them. And so kind of on both sides in that way. And then obviously with the, you know, private sector clients, whether that's, as you said, sort of investors like pension funds who are looking to invest into real estate, or with, let's say, you know, a lot of people know IKEA. IKEA has a subsidiary that actually does private sector residential housing called Bucklock, so we work with them. So that's just a kind of taster of some of the clients, and I think the breadth is what I'm trying to get across, even just in that resi space. For some transactions, I think I mean, I'll talk about one that is very close to my heart because it's something I'm very involved in, but to kind of explain what I mean in terms of central government funding. And you know, I hope this isn't too basic, but this is how I tend to explain it to people who aren't familiar with what I do day to day and really my niche area. So we're talking about grant funding here. So happy, free money, and it's free money going to, affordable housing projects, generally to kind of increase the development of affordable housing. The reason that I get involved or that Trowers gets involved is because when you think about it, where does that money come from? It comes from each of us. We pay our taxes, that goes into Treasury. Treasury sets the budget. Part of that budget will involve provision of subsidy or grant to affordable housing projects, because there is essentially a gap between what we need, the supply, the demand that we have, and the supply. In order to fill that gap, funding is needed. So that budget is set, and there's a policy around how it should be used that is set by government as well. And that's usually in the prospectus. So it sort of says, hey, grant recipients, like, are you interested in this free money to help further your affordable housing project? Well, here are the policy objectives that we'd like this funding to be used towards. And that's where I come in. That funding, when it is drawn down by that grant recipient who's successful in their application, it must be governed by a contract, because this is our money, it's public money. So it needs to be governed quite robustly, I have to say, with a lot of terms and conditions, a lot of contractual obligations about what happens when it goes wrong. And so we develop those contracts for those bodies to make sure that the funding is being drawn down and used appropriately. And if it's not used appropriately, it can be recovered by the government and reallocated to something else that's appropriate. So in a way, I'm like a banking lawyer for grant funding for affordable housing projects. But these are quite hefty budgets. I mean, the last big program from central government was the Affordable Homes Program. So it was £11.5 billion in grant that was being distributed, and we're dealing with the contracts that deal with that. So that's one sort of big project, and again, one that is takes up quite a bit of my time as a lawyer. The other, what's much smaller, but also I thought was interesting, was and to do with the Church of England. And we act for example, the Church of England, big landowner. And the Church of England has been under pressure recently, internally, but also externally, to do more in terms of affordable housing, bearing in mind, that it's sort of wider objectives. So we help them set up a housing association, a regulated body that can provide affordable housing in a certain area of Gloucester. And so that's a much smaller project, but it's kind of, you can see how some of the work that we do isn't just sort of run of the mill, buying, selling land, developing. It's kind of doing quite intricate funding and structuring with quite interesting clients around kind of wider residential housing supply in the country. Okay, that's enough from me, definitely. Shall I hand over to, how about to Jazz this time, since just for fun?
Thanks, Jess. So yeah, just a bit more about planning and environmental and the kind of clients that we act for. I mean, similar to what Jess is saying, there's a whole spread of clients that we act for and advise on a regular basis. So a lot of our clients are also local authority clients. They're also private developers, they're government bodies. So we've also done work for the Department for Education as an example of a government body. In terms of a couple of local authorities that we're acting for right now, this is in regards to two major regeneration estate projects. So one of them is the London Borough of Enfield. Meridian Water is the name of the regeneration project, and they are providing over 10,000 new homes as a result of this scheme. And we've been advising them on all aspects of planning, from pre-application through to negotiating agreements to understand how the development will contribute to local infrastructure, to land assembly, to any tricky issues that come up relating to heritage, for example. So listed buildings, which you might have heard of, where they hold any significance within the vicinity or on the site itself. So we act for the London Borough of Enfield and have done for years. We're also currently acting for Merton Council in South London. They are currently undertaking a comprehensive redevelopment of 3 housing estates in South London with the aim of providing 4,500 new homes through this scheme. So, I mean, following on from what Jess is saying, you can see that there's a clear sort of skew towards affordable housing in terms of what we do a lot of our work on. However, we also act on the private developer side, and also for bodies like the Museum of London. We're currently acting for them in, again, covering all aspects of planning from pre-application through to the grant of planning permission as regards their proposed move from London Wall to the former Smithfield Market buildings in Farringdon. And that's a really interesting project just because it links in with, you know, it's a famous landmark in the middle of London, and there's so many tricky issues that have come up as regards listed buildings and heritage issues that we have had to advise on, and that's always just so interesting. But essentially, we act on large-scale planning applications, often contentious, so we're often instructing leading counsel or barristers, so that's another sort of interesting aspect of what we do. And in terms of environmental, I mean, our partner who heads up the environmental team is based in Manchester, and she's brilliant, and she covers all sorts of things. And as you can imagine, environmental law is a really burgeoning area of law, has been for years, but even more so at the moment, covering things like air quality, biodiversity, building safety, which is obviously very topical, noise impacts and habitats work, particularly protecting endangered species. So that's a little insight into the kind of work that I do, or my department does. Over to Tom.
Hi, so yeah, as I said, I work more on the commercial side of our department, and we work on within that we work on a massive variety of commercial work. So I mean, that's pretty much anything in the realm of commercial property, which is essentially, you know, anything that isn't residential. So in that you've got, you know, retail, so shops, office space, hotels, restaurants and leisure buildings, logistics and storage. Logistics are an industry that's been on the rise recently, thanks to COVID, leading to more sort of online sales. So you've got bigger units out in the country that store all the products. So that's something that's increased a lot in the last few years. We're also strengthening our work on airports as well, so that coming up as well. So that, yeah, I mean, anything you can really think of, we do it in our commercial team. And then within that, we act for both landlords and tenants. We act for investors. So I think Jess mentioned pension funds. So we act for those and for commercial property as well. So that'll be in sort of big purchases and sales. And also, yeah, when they own the property, we'll work on the leases. And then, so yeah, in terms of our clients in the commercial sphere, as I've said, we work for landlords. So personally, I've worked for a global net lease who own, I think, over £500 million worth of assets in the UK, and we work on all their, as well as their purchases, we work on all their leases that they do to their tenants. So that brings in a lot of work. And in the last couple of years, specifically, we actually worked on their acquisition of the McLaren campus in Woking. So if anyone's into F1, which a lot of people are at the moment, then that was, I think, £170 million deal. So it was basically buying the whole of the McLaren building, which is incredible. If you don't know what it looks like, check it on Google. It's an unbelievable building with all their facilities, and then we leased it back to McLaren, so they're still a tenant there. We also have international clients who from Malaysia and Middle East who own quite prestigious assets, so 20 Columbus Courtyard in Canary Wharf, and 1 Silk Street, who Linklater is a current tenant of, owned by clients of ours. We work on that. And then we also act for the tenants as well. So personally, I said earlier, I work specifically in the restaurant field a lot of the time. So one of our clients is Richard Caring's. They run you know, a load of luxury restaurants such as Sexy Fish, the Ivy Asia, back here, Annabelle's, like private members clubs as well, like the George. And also maybe a little bit less glamorous, but all the same of importance and interest. I act a lot for Burger King. So if you've gone into a BK recently, then there's a chance that I worked on the lease for that. But yeah, I mean, even in acting for tenants, we act for a range of restaurant tenants. It's a really wide breadth of client. Next slide, please.
Thanks for that. It's actually just interesting for me even to hear a bit from you guys what you do. But I think anyone who's listening to this webinar can see from that there is a massive range within the department in what we do. And sometimes we are working together on different transactions, but from very different perspectives. Okay, so let's look at a typical life in the day of each of us. Aren't you delighted to see these photos of us again, everybody? Here they are. So we'll just go through one by one. I do find these to be actually kind of fun. I remember when I was a trainee, etc. I found them quite interesting. So typical life for me. Well, I cycle to work every day, die hard, rain or shine. So I'll be cycling in, locking, well, actually I don't even lock my bike up, but I just put it in the sort of bike room. Come through and, usually sort of sometime between 8:30 and 9:30, sit down, get my cup of tea, chat with my trainees. It's in my office, put on music. Sorry, Tom. Tom sits sort of diagonal to me, so occasionally he probably has to overhear my music, but I try to make it, instrumentalish so it doesn't interrupt workflow. And get down to work. The mornings tend to be a lot about firefighting and kind of meetings, that sort of thing for me. I'm not sure how it is for other people, but so for example, a typical day would include a meeting on a new funding stream. I know I've already talked about grant funding. That tends to be a big part of my work, and that was really in the context of acting for the funder, sort of a government funder. But a lot of my days recently have been acting for the recipient of funding. So on the other side, particularly in respect of decarbonization funding. So this is grant funding coming from totally different department, but still funding landlords to do decarbonization works to their stock in order to meet net zero goals. So we're talking about things like more energy efficient measures in their homes, changing the insulation, or changing the boiler, that kind of thing, but it can be quite expensive. So there are funding programs for that. So maybe meeting with a prospective funder who's had their funding approved, been sent the grant funding agreement with all those terms and conditions in it, and I can help walk them through that agreement, what they're going to have to sign up to in order to access their money, where the risks are, and how they can mitigate those risks. So that I might have a meeting about that. It's Pride season, people. So these days, every day, there's something to do with Pride on my list. I'm very happily so too. So a typical day would be looking at Pride fundraising. That's something I tend to really get involved in here at Trowers. If you haven't heard yet, Tom and Jazz, we've got quite an initiative on. We'll be having juniors painting portraits of seniors and auctioning them off. So we've got sort of associates painting portraits of partners in the department. There is a sort of auction methodology to that where all the funds go to a charity, one of my favorites, Stonewall Housing, and we'll have an exhibition and everything all for a donation to the charity. So there are quite a bit of logistics, so I have to say, around organizing something like that. I've got a lot of artists to wrangle at Trowers, so have a meeting with those. Also, just today, this is something I was really involved in, responsible business and ESG. That forms a big part of my work. And so maybe developing a kind of, well, right now I am developing a program for a roundtable that we're hosting with different people from the affordable housing sector, in this case, discussing responsible business and data management as a key risk. So I'd be working on that invitation and kind of trying to make contacts to bring them into that program. That would pretty much take up my morning, I have to say. Lunchtime swings around. We've got a canteen here at Trowers. I am, to be perfectly frank, obsessed with it. I actually started the Instagram page for the canteen many years back, but it started to take over my life and become embarrassing, so I stopped it. But I was taking a picture of my lunch every day. So yeah, I will definitely be eating at the canteen, no matter whether I enjoy what's on the menu or not. That's my vibe. And yeah, and it's just, for me, it's a really great part of life at Trowers, is just kind of the chance to sit down with colleagues, chill, and have a nice meal cooked by some other colleagues. So that's great. After that, in the afternoons, I tend to do something which I call going in the cave, which is sort of non-firefighting mode, where I sort of dedicate a couple of hours to very pure kind of thinking work, where I'm not being distracted by emails, et cetera, et cetera. So I'll try to build that in. Typically would be, for example, a markup has come through from the other side. Don't know, I'm using a bit of jargon that I come across all the time. I found it crazy when I started doing my back scheme here, but the other side means the lawyer of the counterparty, and the markup means they have sort of amended our version of the contract that we've sent to them. So maybe I've sent out a funding agreement to the counterparty's lawyers, they've amended it and sent it back to me, and we're in a negotiation over whether that's acceptable or not. So typically I'll need to go through those amendments carefully and take a view on whether I can advise my client to accept that amendment or reject it, and on what basis. And so that's something I might do in the cave, so to speak, for a couple hours. Coffee, very important part of my day. Can't live without it. Summertime, make it a nice coffee, my people. So that's what I'll be doing. Come back from coffee, potentially an urgent sort of email from a client. This is very typical, that markup that I've been looking at in the cave, so leisurely earlier on, they actually need to finalize the agreement tomorrow because they have a board meeting on Friday, and they need to bring the final form agreement to that board meeting for sign off. So, okay, great, that's become a lot more urgent. I come back from coffee, I basically have to finalize my comments on that, get them over to the client, set up a meeting for tomorrow on Thursday so we can go through them one by one, take instructions, update the contract, turn it around, and send it out to the other side, sort of saying, basically, we're done here, these are the final amends. So that would take me up to the end of the day. And for me, it depends a lot when my day ends. It depends a little bit on the client need, but just to give you a feel for it at Trowers, at least, and sort of my workload, I tend to work quite late, 1 or 2 days a week, maybe more, depending if things are crazy, but build in a few kind of big days of work, maybe a Tuesday, Wednesday, or Thursday often, and late means for me like 9 or 10. But then other days like Mondays and Fridays where I might work at home, I'm sort of logging off at a sensible time, much more often, like sort of 6 or 7. So, and when it's the summertime, I really try to come in early so I can take off early too, because it's just so nice out. All right, that's it for me. Let's hear from Tom.
Thanks, Jess. Yeah, so I start the day generally between sort of 8 and 8:30. A lot of my day will be sort of responding to emails from clients on the other side, responding to client queries, making sure they're happy. There's a lot of client contact, and I imagine all the things I really love about my job is that relationships with clients, just through speaking to them updates, chasing the other side, and then responding to the client based on that. And more chunky work. So as Jess said, a lot of our role will be reviewing sort of amendments from the other side, making sure we take quite a commercial approach as to what we accept and what we have to push back on, taking client instructions on the points that we need from them. So again, liaising with our client so that we know how to mark up a document. And I also have, I don't call it the cave, but I really enjoy that and I might take it. I generally have an hour, like a few hours a day where I will just crack on with a big chunky bit of work. So usually sort of mid-morning, and then again sort of mid-afternoon, and then after 5:30 when the emails slow down, that's when I'll get cracking with a markup or due diligence. So if we're buying a site, we have to check the title and do some searches against the property to make sure that our to use it and it won't have any issues further down the line. Then that's when I'll do that. In that, that's when I'll to make sure that the property's good, and I'll write a report for the client. And then, so yeah, just during a normal day, you might have an call to resolve. They can be quite interesting on the other side. And I sort of just sat back and watched it happen, got the popcorn out because it was quite entertaining. But no, I was genuinely in shock. It was very, very interesting. You might have client meetings today. I've been on site at a property, hence I'm fairly smartly dressed, smarter than normal. So that was good fun. Went and visited an office block, and then yeah, might have a completion or an exchange call, which is generally a lot more positive than the all parties call because everything's been resolved and it's done, and you can be a lot happier and yeah, a lot more celebratory than the all parties call. And in terms of sort of lunch, I generally go to Whitecross Market, which is behind our office. Great, do a great salad box. Love it there. But thanks, that is generally what I fill my day with. Over to Jazz.
Thanks, Tom. So yeah, building on a bit of a trend, coffee. Coffee is an essential part of my day. And it's not just once a day, it's twice a day. So I, on my way into the office, will pop by my favourite coffee cart called the Pink Coffee Cart outside Slaughter and May, which is actually next door to our building. Get a coffee, again, probably between 9 and 9:30 is my arrival into the office, usually on a Wednesday or a Thursday, sometimes Tuesday, sometimes Monday, Friday, depending on what's going on in the week. Yeah, so check emails. So I'm setting up my laptop because we all have laptops now, which we cart hither and everywhere because, well, I think escalated by COVID. Checking emails, I'm chatting to the colleagues I share an office with. I'm in a 3-person office, so with a trainee that I supervise and another senior associate in our team, and we get along very well. So then the last couple of days, for example, I've had a 9:30 meeting and a 10 o'clock meeting. And so I suppose similar to the firefighting, there'll be emails late the previous day saying, can you quickly join a call to discuss this matter so we can bottom this issue out? So, for example, yesterday I joined a meeting with another law firm, and there are a bunch of us lawyers from across many different practice areas in the firm to discuss a facility agreement. And so we're chipping in from property, from planning, from construction, from banking, and we're acting for a Malaysian client. So we're also fairly global in that respect. So that's a 10:30 meeting or a 10 o'clock meeting I had yesterday. Then after that, I'm really enjoying the cave analogy, but I really want to try and get stuck into something in the morning. I find that if I get stuck into something in the morning, it sets my day up better. However, this is predicated on, as Jess mentioned, any of the firefighting that you need to do. So to a certain extent throughout the day, you'll be juggling various priorities, depending on how busy you are, depending on how urgent every matter is, because you can be fairly busy, but you might not have loads of urgent matters on at the same time. But then the next week, they're all urgent. So it's really just knowing how to deal with those when they arrive. I try to, in the first instance, where possible, use as many people to help me as I can. So if I've got a query on a planning matter that I haven't come across before, for example, someone asked me something about judicial review earlier, in fact it was yesterday. So I draft my proposed response, but I'm not 100% sure on this one point. So I go and talk to Marisha, another senior associate in our team, to get her input. And that's really nice. That's what I love about Trowers, and I suppose you'd hope most law firms are open in that way, that you can approach a colleague and discuss a point with them, and then that sets you up to give better advice, I suppose. And you're always learning. That's the thing I'm always finding out. You think that 6 years in you're golden. No, you are always finding out that there's stuff that you don't know. So that's in the morning. So I'm hopefully cracking out, drafting Section 106 agreement, which is kind of our bread and butter transactional documents that we work on, often acting for a local authority, engaging a developer or an applicant who wants to bring forward a development. So they're seeking planning permission for that. So say it's a mixed use residential development, the local authority are saying, okay, fine, but you need to enter into this agreement pursuant to Section 106 of the Town and Country Planning Act 1990, and it will set out various obligations that you've got to comply with if we're going to grant this planning permission. And this will cover any number of topics. So it can be financial contributions to infrastructure in the area or to public schools. It can be parking permit restrictions. It can be having or providing cycling storage on the development for the duration of the development. It can cover all sorts of things, and those the negotiation of those can take several months, depending how big the project is, depending how demanding the parties are. So that's ticking along in the background. For lunch, I am also guilty of going to Whitecross Market more than I should. It's not cheap, people. It's not cheap. But it's delightful. And on a day like today, when it's very hot, often colleagues and I will go and sit in the Barbican, which is just 5 minutes walk from us, and we'll go and sit there and have lunch there. I think similar to what Jess and Tom were saying, I really value having that lunch hour. I really want that break in the middle of the day. I find that that sets me up better for the afternoon in order to focus. Then I am trying to crack through the to-do list. I might have another meeting. I might be attending a training session being given by another department in the firm. I might be giving a training session. So the other week we gave training along with other real estate colleagues to another housing client of ours, Hyde Housing Association. There'll be various coffees had later. So a colleague and I, we pop out for a coffee where we discuss all of the latest sports news. And Tom will know because he used to be a trainee in our department. All we discuss is sport, other than work. In terms of home time, again, as Jess and Tom were saying, varies hugely. So it can be a very healthy 6 or 7. If I'm very busy, depending on how I'm feeling, I might decide to stay in the office, do what I wanted to do, or as far as I can cope, log off, and that's it for the day. On other days, and this is routine changing because of COVID, I might log off earlier, have a couple of hours off, and then log on back at home. Now, I try not to do that because I suppose it means I'm working later, but it does also mean that I have a little bit of an evening. And that's my day. Next slide, please.
Okay, thanks everyone. That was interesting to me, and I hope interesting to everyone else listening in. So this is the last portion. We've only got just under 10 minutes left, so we'll keep it cracking. But we wanted to draw out some of the actual legal issues that we come across typically in a hypothetical site. So this is a segment we call Story of a Site. Let's imagine that here we're acting for the landowner developer of this site, and let's call them, say, Neve Limited, sort of named after your darling host. So Neve Limited has come to Trowers. They want to develop this site. Can I get the next slide, please? So yeah, it won't be all the same. Definitely any developer with a piece of land like this is looking for a mixed use sort of development. And these are all the different aspects that we would probably be able to be involved in and that a typical development might want in a site like this. So let me just start by talking about some of the residential aspects that would come across my desk. Can I get the next slide, please? So yeah, in terms of residential, we've already talked about affordable housing. That comes into every development in a sense, because under the planning system that we have in the UK, every development must include some level of affordable housing or some payment to the authority in lieu of that. So there will be an affordable housing element and development. But what if a Neve Limited wants even more affordable housing? They might need funding and investment for that. Now, we've already talked about grant fundings, won't get into that. What's interesting that comes across my desk quite a bit is other ways of helping to invest in affordable housing. And that could be because it's a good investment. So we see pension funds, et cetera, we've already talked about before, investing in affordable housing because there are quite solid returns. But it also could be because Neve Limited, in this case, needs a little bit more funding. So maybe they partner up, and that's what we mean by structuring. They structure this transaction where they would maybe partner with another developer, maybe a private residential developer who has some cash and can help them cash flow the initial phase of the development so they can have their affordable housing and have the cash to do that. But what the private developer will take out of it is the residential that is sold at the end of the development to private sales, and that will help cross-subsidize the overall funding of the affordable. So that's something that we get involved in, that partnership, and you can either do it through what we call a corporate partnership by setting up a company that both partners own a part of that company, or you can do it through a contractual partnership where you deal with all of the decisions, the amount of money that's being funded, the amount of units that the funder is taking out of the deal, how decisions are made, what happens when things go wrong through a contractual structure. So that's the kind of work that I would typically do on a site like this. The other thing to think about is we saw there's other kind of parts of the site where they might, Neve Limited might be thinking, oh, let's do a retirement village. Those are really quite popular. aging population, etc. But what do we need to do to make sure that happens? Well, Trowers could get involved in the due diligence, like looking at the site, looking at the restrictions on the title, making sure are there rights of way access for things like emergency services. That's important in a retirement village. Are the other bits of the site going to be interesting to retirees? Is there a GP practice nearby? Is there a pharmacy, etc.? So we would get involved in those negotiations and that kind of due diligence. It could be that, for example, that they want to do build to rent. Neve Limited is thinking another way to help cash flow this would be to have retain some of the stock and rent that privately. So we have a mixture of affordable and non-affordable, and we can work with them on the differences that they need in their structure for that. And then also, of course, long-term considerations. Trowers act on all aspects of that. So right from the beginning of the development, where you see bare land here on the slide, but all the way to units have been built, selling them to individuals. 10 years down the line, Neve Limited wants to use this site as security for a loan. We get involved in helping them access that loan, and what do they need to do to the property in order to get the bank comfortable that that's good security. And of course, management. If we're talking about residential, well, any kind of property really, there are management issues over the long term, and we get involved in those management agreements and negotiating them on behalf of, in this case, Neve Limited. Tom, do you want to chip in here?
On commercial? Oh.
That's my fault, actually. It's over to Jazz, I think, is the next slide, please.
So just to cover off some of the things we might be thinking about in respect of the site that Neve Limited is buying, try to approach it, and I suppose I'll talk more about the due diligence side of things that planning might be assisting on, or the planning team. So they will have been instructed by the real estate team internally to provide some due diligence writing for a report on title that we produce for the client to review. So we try to approach this as like detective work. We're trying to find out as much as we possibly can from a planning perspective about this site. And there's numerous sources that we can refer to. And one of the key sources for what we can do on this site, and whether or not it aligns with what Neve Limited wants to do on the site, is referring to the local planning authority, the relevant local planning authority's planning policy. Every local planning authority will have this. They have to have this. And it sets out how development is to be governed in their administrative area. So it's very important to consult this, particularly in the future, if they were to say want to bring forward, want to apply for planning permission, once they've purchased the site. They won't only have to consider local planning authority planning policy, it's also a regional level and a national level. So at a national level, we have this thing called the National Planning Policy Framework. And so I won't talk about it in any more detail, but it's certainly something that has to be considered when putting together a major planning application for such a site as we saw in the previous slides. But that will tell you whether this site that Neve Limited is seeking to buy has been allocated for any particular use already. Does that align with what Neve Limited wants to do? You'll also be looking at a local planning authority search. That will give you lots of information about the planning history and the existing use of the site. That's very important to consider, not only what it has been used for, but what it is being used for. As it looks like we're in the middle of the countryside, there might also be heritage considerations. I mean, there might be if you were in an urban sprawl or urban area, but the types of heritage considerations you might be considering is, given the picture example on this slide, and particularly relevant if you're in a flat area of the countryside, is whether or not there are any heritage sites or listed buildings like a cathedral or a church in the vicinity of the site. And one matter and one planning appeal that I worked on, one of the key issues was that there was a cathedral in the vicinity of the site that our client wanted to develop, which, because of the height of the building and because of the flat nature of the land, this was in the Fens, so in Cambridgeshire, it was impeding upon the view of this cathedral, and therefore harming the significance of that heritage asset. So those are the kind of tests that we have to consider, and that's something that you might have to consider, or Neve Limited would have to consider when bringing forward development. there might also be listed buildings on site, and that would restrict what you're able to do planning wise. So essentially you have to jump through more hoops and you'd have to get an additional listed building consent. Environmental considerations too. So I'll give 2 examples, and of course, as previously mentioned, I don't do environmental work, but something that frequently comes up that we liaise with our environmental colleagues on relates to flood risks. So this is obviously particularly relevant if our client's site is in a low area of ground, so is vulnerable to flood risk, and is that such a high level of risk that actually it's a deal breaker. There are searches that can be done that can help inform a developer on that point. There's also whether or not there are any hazardous contaminants on the site that would need to be considered. Now, it doesn't look like it's necessary for this site, but it might be necessary for an industrial site or something that had previously been used for industrial buildings. There's also whether or not radon is present, but those are the kind of environmental considerations that you're thinking about when you're purchasing a site. And what's interesting about planning in particular is that it's quite political. So obviously the councillors are deciding whether or not to grant planning permission, and their priorities can change depending on essentially who makes up the most of the councillors on the committee. So is that Labour, is that Conservative? The priorities can change, and therefore what they want to do and approve can also change. So that's an interesting aspect to think about when applying for planning permission on a large site. Over to Tom. Next slide, please.
Thanks, Jazz. So in terms of what the commercial parts of the development, Neve Limited, will want to make sure that the housing development on the site have everything they need to live there, really. So talking, a supermarket, shops, restaurants, maybe a leisure centre or gym there. Personally, I'd, quite like a nice pub there. So in that, we will, when there's a commercial element there, we will carry out our due diligence looking for different things. So making sure the land is able to be used for those purposes, both in terms of, restrictions on the site and, access and services. So for example, we want to make sure there's no restrictions on the title which prevent use as, for example, a pub. There might be a conveyance from 1928 because land law in this country dates back so far that you do still see, documents from the 20s and 30s which still affect the property. So you might have something like that which will say in there, you can't use this land for anything except for a house, or specifically, you can't use this land for a public house or bar. And if we do see something like that, then we would go to Neve Limited, our client, and we would say, there is this document which prevents this use. It's particularly old, so you might just take a view on it and say the chances of that being enforced are really low. And also we can get insurance so that if anyone does enforce it, then you're covered by an insurance policy. So that's the sort of thing we'll be looking for when we carry out our due diligence before buying the site. And then after buying the site, we will work on the leases for those units. So to the restaurant, to the supermarket, we will work on negotiating those documents, and we will, make sure that all the leases tie in together. So, for example, one lease has rights that don't interfere with the rights of another lease. We have to make sure that they all fit in together, like a bit of a jigsaw. And then, after all that's done, you've got tenants in, you've got really good tenants in, got great development, then Neve Limited might decide to sell the commercial part of the property, in which case, we would work on that sale, so providing all the information that the buyer needs to buy that area, responding to any queries they have. For example, I recently worked on a sale of a property where the buyer's solicitors asked whether the tenant had cleaned the windows in accordance with their lease. We didn't have a clue whether they'd cleaned their windows. That's probably something more for an inspection of the property themselves. We'll basically try and be as helpful as possible so that the buyer has as much information and we can get the deal done as quickly as possible. We will negotiate the documents on that sale to make sure that Neve Limited can get the money from the sale, and further down the line they're not contacted by the buyer saying that, you know, we've got these issues, you need to sort this out, you need to sort this out. Neve Limited would be protected, and then yeah, so that eventually Neve Limited will get the money from that sale, and yeah, that is the full life cycle of this site from the commercial perspective, and that is the end of our presentation. Thank you.
Brilliant, thank you very much. That was really, really interesting actually, and quite enjoyed it being called Neve Limited. We've got a lot of great questions come in, so I'm going to try and get through as many as we can in the last 10 minutes. The first one is from a fellow history student who wants to know how you found the process of converting into studying law and whether you felt at a disadvantage. So Jasmine, do you want to go answering that one?
Yeah, I personally am very glad I studied history and then converted to law. I wanted to do a subject I just enjoyed learning about, and to be honest, law probably wasn't even on my radar when I was applying for unis. The conversion course is obviously, it's a 1-year course, pretty intense, but I really enjoyed it. And you just have to crack on with it, and it's definitely possible, and I definitely did not feel that I was at a disadvantage for having done a non-law degree and converting to law. And in fact, I would say in my experience when I talk to people and what they did, there's, I'm sure, a 50-50, and sometimes it feels like there's more people who didn't do law at uni than did law, and so certainly didn't feel the effects of that at all. Tom, I don't know if you had a different experience.
No, I'd agree with that. I really enjoyed it. Enjoyed doing history at university, something I was particularly interested in, and the conversion course was intense but really enjoyable. And as Jasmine says, there's a really high number of people that do it in that route. It's a very well-trodden path. So no disadvantage for me.
Brilliant, thank you both. And if there are other non-law students in the audience, Your Careers Net has a non-law hub with lots of advice. So if you're feeling nervous about anything, you can check out some of our content on there. Next question. What sets Trowers apart from its competitors, and why did you choose to work at Trowers? Jessica, I don't know if you want to take this one maybe.
Yeah, sure. So I think the sort of our real estate strength does set it apart. What we've been discussing today, that kind of cradle to grave, every aspect of the transaction, public, private sector is special. We have a particular strength on the public sector side and affordable housing that we've gone into here. I don't just say that because that's my area, but it's just really kind of quite dominant in the market. I think the other thing that sets Trowers apart is, I know a lot of firms say this, but the culture, I really believe it's true at Trowers in many ways. How do I put this? I think if you're just not very nice, you just won't thrive. Like there's just a real thing, like you've just got to be decent. And that comes through to me, of course, in my passion around the D&I side, where what I think is very different at Trowers, at least when I talk to other firms, is that the D&I is driven from sort of fee earners, from sort of the junior level, and that feeds in the policy, and the senior management is very supportive, but it's not a kind of, okay, here's the policy, everyone just has to comply with. It's like, what's the need? What do we require here? What do we want for our own employees? And what's right, from a kind of ethical perspective. And that is just kind of very organically driven. So I find it really fun to see that at Trowers and see it grow from individuals' passion.
Brilliant, thank you. Jasmine or Tom, anything you'd like to add to that?
I'd probably just then add in the fact that we have a presence in the Middle East as well, which I suppose adds another dimension to what Trowers does. And actually, they've had a presence out there for a long time, for decades. And actually, as a trainee, it's not guaranteed, but there is an opportunity to perhaps do 6 months out there, which for me was certainly appealing when I was applying for a training contract.
Brilliant, thank you. Tom, we've had a lot of fellow football fans in the audience, and people are wondering, other than football, what other networks or activities do you have at the firm?
We have a lot. I mean, I know there's a lot of other sports. There's definitely netball. There's pretty much anything you're interested in. If there isn't already a society for it, you can start one up. There's a real sort of, the firm is very welcoming in terms of, you know, people making sure their interests are, you know, encouraged. So I mean, there's a number of, I mean, there's mental health committee. There's Jess has already spoken to the D&I stuff, so that we really are encouraged to join in with that, participate with those, but also, you know, if there is a space, you know, if it's for an interest, then get involved, start up yourself.
Brilliant, thank you. Next question, obviously students are always hearing this buzzword, commercial awareness. So they're wondering what students should know is happening in real estate as a practice area right now. What's impacting the market? What should they be speaking about if they get an interview or vacation scheme?
Well, one thing that I would mention is you'll see a lot of, it's sort of almost interesting that a lot of the talk that I've said about affordable housing connects with funding. And I think that's because it's a bit of a difficult time in terms of funding when we're talking about residential market. I mean, the costs are high. There's tremendous pressure on labor costs and supply costs. The market has slowed down in some respects. So where we have affordable housing providers want to do cross subsidy with private residential sales, that's difficult because they're not getting the same prices, or it's difficult to move properties. And affordable housing is highly regulated because of things like Grenfell Tower. And you know, it's great that we're having better building safety measures brought in, but they are expensive to implement, and decarbonization is also expensive. So there's a lot of expenses. So that's why funding has become so important, and having interesting structures to get funding where it's needed.
Brilliant,
Yeah,
thank you. Right.
Oops.
Oh, no, go on, Tom.
I was just going to say, generally, in terms of the work that I do, there's generally rents are lower for tenants now than they would have been a few years ago. I think there's been a massive impact of COVID. There's less demand for office space. The office space that is popular is more. There's more services offered at those offices. So, you know, proper high-end category A offices are in higher demand, but the sort of regular offices less so. And like I said earlier, the sort of logistics spaces have gone up a lot. The demand for those is much higher. So that's sort of a general trend that we're seeing at the moment.
On the planning side, I'll just chip in, there's the forthcoming levelling up and regeneration bill, which should be passed, I think, I can't remember if it's on its third reading or something, but that's following up on the planning white paper, which was published in 2020, which is likely to, or is planning, it's a poor use of word, to introduce lots of changes to the planning regime. So there could be lots happening. So it might be worth having a read of a summary of the proposed changes of that bill.
Thank you. Okay, I think we've got time for one last question, so I'm going to pose this to all three of you very quickly. Your favourite thing about working at Trowers? Jasmine, do you want to go first? I'll put you in the hot seat.
Oh, it's so cheesy, but honestly, I've just met some like long life friends here. So I've genuinely met people who I'm going to be in touch with for, you know, we're friends more than colleagues outside of the office. I've got a really good supportive team. So my boss is amazing. She's someone who has your back and looks to challenge you, but also support you along the way on your journey. So I'm always feeling like I'm not stagnant as well. So I'd say that.
Thank you. Jessica, do you want to go next?
Sure. So I think this is kind of similar to, it's the people and the culture, but I think in particular, I'm just thinking about how the partner who heads up our diversity circulated an email yesterday that Trowers is, I think, the second highest in the country level of senior equity partners who are women. And that's sort of where that comes from in terms of, oh, sorry, there's a fire alarm. Hope you don't hear it in the background, but it's just a test. But I think that really informs the culture, not just because they are women, but it's always been a progressive firm. You know, the first woman who ever qualified as a lawyer was from Trowers back in 1907 or something. And there's always been a sense that, sort of as Tom was saying, you can be yourself, and you can kind of be different than what you might think of as a typical lawyer at Trowers. And the focus on diversity, as I said before, it comes from the ground up. It's not something that people are just saying, it's really what the firm is living. And I see that, in the way that people treat each other, with like a lot less hierarchy than I've heard of from other firms, and a lot more openness.
Thank you. And last but not least, Tom, I'm going to give you 20 seconds very quickly.
Okay, no alarms here. Yeah, I would completely agree with everything that's said. I think the sort of encouragement of individuality, there's no sort of cookie cutter for trainees here. You can tell that it's you know, from that, you know, there is this, everyone's allowed to be themselves, and it's encouraged. And I think, adding to that, the fact that so many people at the firm have trained at the firm, I think there is an encouragement of a sort of organic growth in the firm, and that's something that's really impressive.
Brilliant, thank you all very much. So that is the end of this masterclass. Thank you so much to our panel for taking part in the conversation, and to you, the audience, for joining us today. We hope you found this session informative and inspiring. Before you go, just another reminder to attendees that we'll be sending out a link containing the recorded session, so please keep an eye out for that. A survey will also be popping up once this masterclass has ended, so please fill that in to let us know how you enjoyed today and what other topics you would like to see us cover in the future. Thank you very much once again to all of our lovely panelists from Trowers, and to everyone for attending today. We look forward to seeing you again next time.